final exam study guide. 4 questions as always, and you will be assigned 2 of these randomly. So question number 1 is from chapter 9. Explain how the socialization hypothesis and the opportunity hypothesis of delinquency seek to explain the influence of peers on whether a child engages in delinquency. So these are 2 different theories, so make sure that you are discussing them separately. Don't just lump them into one sentence and make a general statement. Make sure that you're giving the detail to support whatever statements that you make. Explain the definitions of gangs described in the textbook. Which one or ones do you think makes the most sense to define gangs today and why? You will notice that I did give you the page numbers to refer to make it a little easier for you as you are preparing for this exam. Finally, discuss the 3 types of gangs that females most commonly join and explain the findings from recent studies. Okay, so that's question 1. Question 2 is from chapter 11. Discuss the concept of retribution and explain its roots. Explain why retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence increased from the 1970s through the 1990s. So when you discuss retribution, make sure that you give that detail that is discussed in the text about the roots, Christianity, etc. In regard to those 3 types of punishment that we saw an increase of, because as you'll remember in this chapter, there was a period in the 1960s when juveniles, because of some very high-profile Supreme Court cases, were afforded the same rights as, many of the same rights as adults. However, by the early 1970s, the tide had turned and people once again thought it was better to go back to being punitive rather than rehabilitative. And so the use of retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence increased for juveniles during that 20-year period. So make sure that you're giving the detail about that 20-year or so period. Based on the information regarding the development of brains, do you think that it is appropriate to charge juveniles accused of heinous crimes, things such as murder, rape, deadly assault, as adults? Provide 2 reasons for your opinion. You all know by the end of this semester now that there are many states that still do allow juveniles to be charged as adults. Just depends on the age of the juvenile as well as the crime the juvenile is accused of. Some people believe that it is appropriate given certain circumstances. Others believe that it is never appropriate. Which camp do you fall in? And provide 2 reasons for your opinion. Question number 3 is from chapter 12. Summarize the research regarding police-juvenile contact. So I specifically gave you page numbers there because we're focusing on the police-juvenile contact. There's a different section that's the police-juvenile interaction, but I want you to focus on the contact piece of it. Explain the cases of Yarborough versus Alvarado and JDB versus North Carolina. So give me the background of the cases. What did they involve? Who was the juvenile involved? What was the behavior, etc.? And then how did the court decide the case? Then tell me, how did this change the way that people began to think of when juveniles are in custody? We know that for adults, if you're a criminal justice major, you know that people are considered to be in custody when they're not able to leave. So what I always tell my students in criminal justice classes is, if you are ever approached by an officer who says, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? You can simply ask, am I in custody? If the answer is no, then you're free to say, no, I don't want to talk to you. If the answer is yes, then of course you are being detained, which then triggers your right to be read the Miranda rights. So, how did these two cases change the way that youth are now considered to be in custody? And the Yarborough case is from 2004, and the JDB case is 2011. So these are at least within the last 20 years. How did these cases, sorry, I did that. Review the 11 strategies for interacting with youth in violent or traumatic situations. So remember, if you go back and you look at page 312, there is that little diagram of the 11 different ways or strategies that law enforcement officers can use when they're interacting with juveniles or youth who are in violent or traumatic situations. Name at least one thing you think law enforcement should be taught to do in their interactions with juveniles, and provide one reason for your ideas. The last question from chapter 15 asks, choose two approaches to prevent delinquency and explain the focus of the approaches and their effectiveness based on the research. There are about 4 or 5 different approaches to preventing delinquency, so choose 2 of them, explain the focus of the two approaches you've chosen, and the effectiveness of these approaches based on the research. And remember, talk about each one separately. It makes it easier for me to read when you talk about them separately as opposed to talking about them both at the same time. It can get confusing for me, so please help me and talk about them separately. Choose 2 restorative justice programs discussed in the textbook and explain how each program works and the effectiveness of each. So there are about 4 or 5 different restorative justice programs that have been created. There's some discussion in the text about how these programs work and the effectiveness of each of these. And so make sure that you thoroughly discuss the 2 programs that you choose. That's it, folks. You know the drill. You make an outline, and you should be pretty well prepared to answer whatever 2 questions you're assigned. Some of you have been writing out answers to all 4 of them and then copying and pasting them into the submission box, and you get very, very high A's on those. Others sometimes are not as prepared, but you know what kind of student you are, and so I don't need to wish you good luck, just study.